From the ghoulish horrors of the flesh-eater courts to the less ghoulish, but admittedly still kind of horrific in their own way, we are now moving on to the forests and the wild forces of the Sylvaneth. Now this is another faction I don't know all that well, but I know they can do a lot of tricks with their wildwoods, and they also have some fairly big tanky creatures and monsters to bring to the field. So let's jump into their faction pack and see what Alarielle has got up her sleeve. In terms of your battle traits, you have 3 and they all play into your awakened wildwood mechanics. You can, at the end of any turn, use the Endless Growth ability, which allows you to pick any number of Sylvaneth units wholly within 6 inches of a friendly wildwood, and each of those units gets healed D3. So if your wildwoods are near to objectives or where the fighting is heaviest, you can keep your units around and alive that much longer to give you a bit of an advantage over your opponent. You can also, again at the end of any turn, use the Strike and Fade rule, which is a fantastic mobility trick enabling you to pick a Sylvaneth unit that is in combat and wholly within 6 inches of a wildwood, and they can be removed from the battlefield and set up again 9 inches from enemies and wholly within 6 inches of a different wildwood. So if you are in a nasty combat you don't want to stick around in, or you need to urgently get to another part of the board or near another objective, you can just nope out of that combat and appear again near another one of your wildwoods. Now it's worth mentioning right here, just because it isn't super clear sometimes, you can have up to 3 wildwoods in your army, so you will always at least have a couple of these dotted around, and there are some other rules in the pack that allow you to summon or generate another wildwood if you do have less than 3, so you can really put them in quite varied and useful locations to make sure you can get the most out of them and put them where you think they're going to be the most benefit to you, or where you think the combat may be the heaviest. The final battle trait is Walk the Hidden Paths. This is once per turn in your movement phase. You can pick a Sylvaneth unit that isn't in combat and is wholly within 6 inches of a wildwood, and they can be removed from the board and set back down 9 inches from enemies and wholly within 6 inches of another wildwood. So it's similar to Strike and Fade, it just specifies your unit can't be in combat and it's in your movement phase instead. So it's a great way potentially to get a bit of board-wide movement to set yourself up for some shooting or a potential charge that you may want to do later on in your turn. Overall, it's fair to say they're potentially some fairly niche battle traits, and they are all very dependent on your wildwoods, so they can be a bit limiting if you place them badly or your opponent counters your wildwoods, but if you place them well or you are kind of tactical and thoughtful about where you put them, they can be super flexible and powerful. And I like the fact that you can use these to make your army almost impossible to pin down and able to really firefight very effectively to get that support exactly where you need it on a certain objective or on a certain flank to really punish your opponent for potentially overstretching themselves. As usual, you do have 4 formations to take advantage of as well, all of them being pretty useful depending on how you are building your army. The Healing Song from Lords of the Clan ties into your wildwoods, letting you heal a flat 3 instead of D3 when you use your Endless Growth ability on your Sylvaneth monsters, which, as I said, is a fair few units in your roster, so this can really help those bigger, scarier units be even more resilient against the enemy. So if you are running a lot of the big beasts and creatures, this could be a very good one to pick. The Forest Folk come with a Lacerating Strike, which grants you +1 rend to your non-Kernothy units, infantry units should I say, if they charge, which does limit it somewhat, being only infantry and also not your scary infantry of the Hunters, but it does still help things like your Dryads and your Revenants do a bit more in melee, which is nice, and it can also of course give a bit of a boost to your foot infantry heroes as well. The Terror in the Eaves is the passive for the Outcasts. This is a very simple one that subtracts 3 from enemy control scores while they are in combat with your Sylvaneth units, so it's not terribly exciting to be fair, but it is very strong. You will almost always be in combat and fighting over objectives in AOS, so just making sure it is that much more difficult for your opponent to hold or steal or contest your objectives when you are fighting without relying on a dice roll or some other effect to go off is very, very strong. And this is a very strong formation if you are just focused on winning the game, scoring those points and you know, racking up the win that way. And then finally, Free Spirits brings you the Fleet and Swift ability, which is once per turn in your charge phase, you can pick a Sylvaneth cavalry unit and it can charge even if it's ran. So this will be on things like your Revenant Seekers and your Spite Rider Lances, and just makes that one big important charge much more likely and much more reliable when you need it to. So if you are going cav heavy or even just have one big Death Star style unit of cavalry, this one could be a viable pick, and as we will see later on, your cavalry is actually fairly good. So I think in general, all of the formations have their uses. The Outcasts, I would say, is the more generalist, all-round useful one, but if you are going monster, infantry, or cavalry heavy, the other three can definitely add a lot of value to your force if you pick the appropriate one. In terms of your traits and artifacts, the traits start off with Radiant Spirit, which is a reaction when your opponent declares a spell or a prayer and is used by your hero if they are wholly within 12 inches of a friendly Sylvaneth unit that is the target of that enemy spell or prayer. And you can roll a dice, and on a 3+, you ignore that effect. So it's a fairly solid, somewhat reliable way to prevent some enemy debuffs or damaging spells from affecting what can be a decent little bubble in your army thanks to that 12-inch range. And being on a 3+ definitely isn't a guarantee of it, you know, being a defensive success, but it does add that extra layer of defense on top of things like unbinds and the like, to just make it that much harder for your opponent to be able to rely on their spells impacting you. The Warsinger trait is used in your movement phase, and this lets you pick a Sylvaneth unit wholly within 12 inches of your hero, and they get to add 2 inches to their movement for the turn. So turning a lot of your already quite speedy units into absolute fighter jets. And on top of that, it being any unit means that even things like your cavalry can be impacted, which makes the Free Spirits formation ability even more terrifying, with a possible turn 1 charge actually quite likely on things like your Seekers or your Lancers. The last trait is the Spell Singer passive, which gives your hero +1 to casting rolls when they are in combat range of a Wildwood, or if they aren't a wizard, it gives them the Wizard 1 rule, so they can at least attempt to spell. Now this is always really handy, either getting an extra spell or just a more reliable caster is welcome, and you can easily get to within combat range of a Wildwood, especially on a caster that you may want to be keeping back a bit. So this is another straightforward, really quite easy to use on a non-caster hero or a caster hero. It gives them a good buff either way. So this is another good, solid, straightforward trait to bring. On the artifact front, you get Seed of Rebirth, which is a passive and lets your hero roll a dice if they were going to be destroyed, and on a 3+, they can instead ignore any remaining damage that is inflicted and heal 1. So you basically get to stay alive with 1 health left. We've seen this before in a few other armies, and it is always a nice way to keep some of your heroes alive, especially some of your bigger, tankier heroes that you may want to keep alive for a bit longer to bring their buffs or damage output that your opponent may be trying to focus down. The Greenwood Gladius is used in the combat phase and is a straightforward pick an enemy unit and roll a d3, and on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage. So it's a little bit of extra output, which could be nice. I mean, it's nothing amazing, but if you want to go all in on a heavy hitting melee hero, this will definitely help on that front. The better pick, in my opinion though, is the Crown of Fell Bowers. This is again in the combat phase, but you pick an enemy unit and you roll a dice, and on a 3+, you get +1 to wound that enemy unit for all friendly Sylvaneth models that attack it. So not just the hero, but anything else that is in combat and throwing some attacks towards that enemy will get that +1 to wound. So to me, this is just a bigger and better buff than the Gladius. It does help your hero themselves, but it also helps a few other things around them, and getting that +1 to wound can potentially have a bigger impact than just doing 2 or 3 mortal damage. So I would say if you have to pick between the two, I would be going for the Crown every single time. The spell lore for the Sylvaneth is the Lore of the Deepwood, and as usual brings you 3 unique spells. The first of which is your Unlimited spell. This is cast on a 6+, and Tree Song allows you to place a new awakened Wildwood on the board wholly within 18 inches from the caster and 3 inches away from enemies. Now, as I said, you can only do this if there are less than 3 wildwoods on the board, because that is the maximum you can have, but it means if you do just have 1 or 2 and you want to bring another one on, or one gets destroyed, you can bring one back, and being able to choose where it goes in that fairly big bubble does mean you can really use it to put in a place where it's going to help a lot, give some extra healing in an ongoing combat, or just buff a unit or get you some extra movement in a following turn by putting it really near to an opponent's objective. So it is just a very tactical and flexible and useful spell. However, it has another part. If you do already have 3 wildwoods on the board, it just heals them all by 3. So even if you do have the maximum 3 wildwoods, it is still a nice way to keep the ones you've got around a little bit longer by just topping them up in terms of their healing. Wrathful Spirits is up next, and it's cast on a 6+. This lets you pick a wildwood wholly within 18 inches of the caster, and until your next turn, you add 1 rend to all Sylvaneth units that are wholly within 6 inches of the wildwood. So it does require your unit to be quite close to it, but you can potentially buff up a few friendly units and give them that tasty extra bit of rend to help them kill off an enemy or get an advantage in combat to steal an objective they may be near to. So it is a very useful aura ability or aura spell to have. And then finally we get the Dwellers Below. This is an old favourite from Warhammer Fantasy. It's cast on a 7, and what this does is it lets you pick an enemy unit that is within 12 inches of the wizard or within 6 inches of a wildwood, and you roll a dice for each model in the enemy unit, and on a 5+ they take a mortal damage. So it's like we've seen before, it's a great way to clear out chaff or do a load of damage to those bigger blobs of enemies. So it's super useful, super fun, and another great way to potentially flip an objective on a combat near a wildwood, because you can do this when you are casting from the wizard or from a wildwood, so it has that extra little bit of flexibility baked into it too. As usual, we'll take a look at the manifestation lore a bit later on, but you do get 3 summons as you might expect, and they are all cast on a 7+. But onto the main war scrolls, we start with your god being, who is Alarielle, and her gigantic beetle. Now Alarielle is a big chunk cheaper now. She is only 680 points down from 803rd, and she has retained her 16 health, 3 up save, and a 6 up ward. She can also fly, which is really good for her mobility, and she still has a somewhat terrifying ranged attack from the Spear of Karno, which hits on 2s, wounds on 3s, with 2 rend and a flat 4 damage. The spear can also be used in melee, where it jumps to 5 attacks, hitting and wounding on 3s with 2 rend and 2 damage, and then her beetle gets a whopping 6 attacks. Now they only hit on 4s, but wounding on 2s with 2 rend and a flat 4 damage will let them take huge chunks out of pretty much anything from infantry to big monsters, so she is really quite scary in combat. A lot of her value comes from being a wizard though, of course, and she is a 3-cast wizard, which is very good, and then she gets even better because she can grant herself +1 to her casting rolls with Life Bloom, or if she is injured, she can instead choose to heal 2d3. Now this is in any hero phase, so you are likely going to want to get the bonus to cast in your hero phase, but then in your opponent's hero phase, you can potentially heal up any damage done to her before you go into their shooting and fight phases, just to make sure she survives. She does have her own spell in Metamorphosis, which is cast on a 7 and lets you pick an enemy unit within 12 inches and you do 2d3 mortal damage to them, which isn't awful in itself, an average of about 4 mortal damage. But if you destroy the enemy target, you can then also use the Tree Song spell immediately. So that is potentially generating you an extra wildwood, or at least healing those that are on the board already. So it is a really fantastic little combo spell, I think. In the movement phase, she can use Rite of Life, which is the return a destroyed unit rule a lot of the big heroes have. You can pick a destroyed Sylvaneth unit and on a 4+, set up a replacement unit with half the number of models, wholly within 9 inches of a wildwood and 9 inches from enemies. You can also choose to bring a monster unit back, so something like one of your tree lords, but they do take 8 unavoidable damage if you do so. So they basically come back at a little bit under half health if you do that. So it does give you some flexibility if you have gone monster heavy, but it is just a very good way to bring some of your units back to get a bit more value out of her 680 points. Finally, of course, as a monster, she does have a rampage. Hers is Living Battering Ram, and this is done in any charge phase. You can pick an enemy unit that you have charged that is within 1 inch, and you roll a dice, and on a 3+, you do that much mortal damage. So between 3 and 6 mortal damage to an enemy unit, which isn't bad. It's a nice way to soften up an enemy before you actually get swinging into them with all of your 2 or 4 damage attacks. So she is good. She is pricey, but like other big heroes, being able to bring some units back at half strength can really mitigate a lot of her cost. And she is a 3-cast wizard, which is really good. So she can be surprisingly cost effective if you do manage to get the most out of her if you are bringing her along. Up next is the Lady of Vines. She's a slightly smaller hero, being only 8 health, but still having a solid 3-up save and also being a 2-cast wizard, which is really good. She has gone up a tad to 280 points from 230, which is a hit considering she has actually lost 2 health compared to 3rd edition. However, she can still put out some good work, with her ranged attack hitting and wounding on 2s with 1 rend and d6 damage. Now it has only dropped to a 12-inch range, so it is a bit close for comfort, but that d6 damage can be quite scary. In melee, all of her weapons have been combined to just 6 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 2 rend, 2 damage, and have the crit mortal rule, so that is actually fairly solid as well, and she can do a good bit of work into those squishier infantry and 4-up save monsters. And then in terms of her actual abilities, on top of being a 2-cast wizard, she has the Verdian Crown passive, which means she counts as a wildwood for your battle trait abilities, so your units can deep strike to and from her and also get a bit of extra healing around her, which is a really strong, really useful ability to bring to the board. She is also a monster too, so she has a rampage and hers is Writhing Vines. This is in any combat phase. You pick an enemy unit she's in combat with and you roll a dice, and on a 2+, you can either make them -1 to hit with barrier, or you can instead ensnare the enemy unit and make it so that all the friendly attacks into them get +1 to hit. So it depends if you want to debuff an enemy or buff your own units. If you've got a load of other friendly units in that combat and you need the target dead, then Ensnare is a very strong multiplier for getting the most out of the rest of your units. She does also have a very strong spell, which is cast on a 7, but Aspect of the Everqueen grants all friendly units wholly within 12 inches a 5-up ward. So that is ridiculously good alongside the healing she brings thanks to being essentially a wildwood. So she can be a really, really strong anchor unit for a big swathe of your army if this spell goes off. Next up we have the hate-filled Dker Hamadreth. She has a 9 health and a 3-up save, so she has also dropped slightly going down from 10, and she has also got a slight bump in price, but only 10 points going up to 310, so it's not huge. She does keep her 10 ranged attacks from the Flitter Furies, but these only hit and wound on 4s now, which is quite a lot worse with 1 rend and 1 damage, so they're okay, but they're nothing particularly amazing. In melee, however, she does have a solid set of dice in terms of what she can throw out. She's got 5 attacks with her Talons, which are pretty potent, hitting on 3s, wounding on 2s with 1 rend, but 2 rend against infantry and then also 2 damage. And then her Swarm of Squirmlings, they now again only hit and wound on 4s rather than 3s, and they are still 1 rend and 1 damage, but they are also +1 rend against infantry. So she gains an extra Talon attack, but her swarm attacks have got a bit worse. But overall, it is still 15 attacks total, so she does have a fairly high ceiling and a lot of potential. She is also a wizard, albeit a 1-cast one. Her spell is Song of Spite, which is cast on a 6. This lets you pick an enemy infantry unit within 12 inches of her, and for the rest of the turn, all of your friendly Sylvaneth units get +1 to hit them. And on top of that, any Spite Revenant or Twist Wield units also get +1 to wound. So if you combo that up, you can potentially get a lot of damage into a key enemy target with this spell. She also has the rule of Mercurial Aspect, which is once per turn in any hero phase, she can either add 10 to the attacks of her Flitter Furies or to her swarm of Squirmlings. So she can get either of those up to 20 attacks, which does make them much better. And even though they are only hitting and wounding on 4s, does mean she can be a fairly valid threat into bigger, squishier units of infantry or chaff. Her final ability, also being a monster, is her Rampage. Primal Terror is in any combat phase. Again, you pick an enemy unit she's in combat with and you roll a dice, and on a 2+, you halve the target's control score. So you're not reducing it by a dice roll or anything, you are just halving it. So it could actually be better or worse, because obviously you can't reduce it by up to like 6, like it would be if you just reduced it by the d6 roll. But the good thing about this is you can plan around it a lot more, because you know what your opponent's control value will be, so you know what the halved value will be. So if they've got a control of 4, you know you will be dropping it to 2, whereas if you were relying on that d6 roll, you wouldn't know what the value is going to be. So you could be dropping a big monster with a control value of 10 to just 8, whereas using this, you know you'll be dropping them to 5. So it can be not quite as powerful in some ways, but it's a lot more reliable, and you will know ahead of time if it goes off what the new control score will be. So it is a lot more easy to plan around it. Next up, we have the newest Sylvaneth model with a Belthanos. He's also a monster, although not a wizard this one. Belthanos is a bit cheaper now. He's dropped to 330 points instead of 360. He's still got that incredibly good 12-inch move with 14 health and a 3-up save, and he can fly, which helps him get around thanks to his own bug mount. He has, however, lost his 5-up ward, which is a big hit for his durability. And then on the output front, he's gained an attack on his glaive, which is now 5 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 2 rend and 2 damage. So it does unfortunately have less rend and damage now, but it does go back up to 3 damage on the charge, which is nice. And then the Beetle's attacks, they are now 4s and 2s rather than 4s and 3s, so that is better. It is now the same 2 rend, but is now just a flat 3 damage all the time rather than starting at 4. So it starts off a little bit weaker, but then obviously in the old version, that degraded down to 2. So overall, there's been a few buffs, but also a few nerfs on the melee front. He can still affect a terrain feature and make it count as an awakened wildwood for your battle traits, thanks to his once per battle ability of Nature Etheric. And then he can also still bring the solid buff of Kernothi Warhorn, which gives up to 3 friendly units the ability to charge, even if they have a run. There's no range on this, it's just 3 units board wide, so they can now get essentially an extra d6 inches of distance before they charge. So this is still really good and can make your speedy army even speedier, potentially getting you up to 4 units being able to run and charge if you choose the formation that gives you the run and charge ability as well. Finally, he also has the Rampage Rhythm of the Chase, which is done in any combat phase, and again, you pick an enemy unit and roll a dice. This time you roll a d3, and on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage to them, but then you can also pick this model up and set it back down within 1 inch of the target. So it's a great way to not only do a little bit of chip damage, but also get some extra movement on this guy to get away from a particular hero you don't want to have putting attacks into you, or just moving around to get nearer to an objective or to get closer to another enemy unit you may want to go towards in a subsequent turn. So it is just a very useful movement tool with a tiny bit of chip damage added on for good measure. We don't end there though, because the Sylvaneth have yet another hero, another 2-cast wizard in fact, the Warlock Revenant. He's dropped 60 points down to 210. He still has that 7 health and a 5-up save, however has dropped to a 6-inch move instead of 8, and also dropped to just a 6-up ward instead of a 4-up, which is a big nerf. The Revenant now has a combined melee profile, so instead of 8 attacks it is now just 5 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and d3 damage, which is okay, I guess. It's nothing spectacular, but it's fairly par for the course for most heroes. Again, you have a War Scrolls spell with Unleash Swarm of Spites, which is cast on a 7 and lets you pick a friendly wildwood wholly within 18 inches, and then up to 3 enemy units within 9 inches of that wildwood, and you roll a d3 for each, and you do that much mortal damage on a 2+. So it's a nice way to do up to 6 or 9 mortal damage to a few enemy units near one of your wildwoods. He can also add 1 to unbinding and banishment rolls when he is wholly within 6 inches of a wildwood, thanks to Wildwood Revenants, which does make him add some even better spell defense to your army. And then finally, he has Alarielle Song, which is a passive letting him grant friendly Sylvaneth units wholly within 12 inches of him a 6-up ward, and also making enemy units have a -1 to theirs. So he is a fairly decent buffing multiplier for your forces, as well as a good debuffer for the enemy. He can get rid of things like Death Army's 6-up ward save completely, so that is a fairly good bit of extra output he can give to your guys if you are up against armies that have ward saves. The generic hero of the Arch Revenant is next. This guy has 6 health and a 4-up save, but has likewise caught a bump in price to 170. He's got 5 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage, which as I said is fairly standard as far as heroes go. He can, however, use his Crescent Shield ability to bump that up, either choosing an aggressive stance in the combat phase for +1 attacks and +1 to wound, which does make his melee a lot more scary, or he can instead go defensive and gain a 4-up ward for the turn. So it depends what he's up against. If you need him to survive a load of scary damage, then go for the ward. But if you just want him to plow through a big unit of chaff as quickly as possible, then instead maybe go for the aggressive stance just to clear through them. He can also give a quite nice buff of +1 to wound to friendly Karno units wholly within 12 inches of him, so he is more of a melee buffer than anything else, but he can do that reasonably well, and he can also be an okay hero defensively if you need him to with that 4-up ward. My favourite tree, the Spirit of Durthu, has had a little decrease down to 330 points. He is still 14 health with a 3-up save and still a monster as you would expect. He's got a fairly solid ranged attack with his Verdant Blast, which is 5 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage. So that isn't awful for a ranged attack. It will kill off a couple of 4-up save infantry before he charges in. And then he's got 4 attacks with his sword that are 3s and 2s with 2 rend and a flat 5 damage, which is insanely good. And also 3 rend against monsters. So that is going to make him incredibly good into those big, scary enemy monster units. On top of that, he's also got 2 extra attacks that are also reasonably good. They are 2 rend and 3 damage, but they do also have the crit mortal rule for even more ways for him to get through tough enemy armor. So he is very good in combat and very good at killing monsters. He also gets +1 to hit when the unit he's targeting is within 3 inches of a wildwood. So fighting around them, he can be 2s and 2s with his sword, which is fantastic. And then he can also use his Titanic Dual Rampage, which lets you pick an enemy monster and roll a dice. And on a 3+, you subtract 1 from the monster's attacks. So he is, as I said, incredibly good at going in and killing monsters, but also quite reliable at debuffing them and making it so that their return swings, if they do survive, are much weaker too. So for 330 points, he is a solid, scary, tanky beatstick, and if your opponent has a lot of monsters, he is going to be a great pick for going down and hunting those. The regular Tree Lord has the same 14 health and 3-up save. It's got a slightly worse version of Durthu's attacks. Strangle Roots is 3 shots, but they do hit on 3s and wound on 2s, which is a little bit better than Durthu's. In melee though, they are only 2 damage on their main attacks with 5 attacks at 4s and 2s, and then they do also have those Impaling Talons, which are the same as Durthu's with 3 damage and crit mortals. In terms of their other rules, they do have a Rampage, which can make an enemy unit -1 to their wound rolls on a 3+ on a d6, which can also massively help to neuter your opponent's output, whilst in any shooting phase, they can do Entangling Grasp, which prevents a unit that has had any damage done to it by your Strangle Roots be unable to run or retreat until your next turn on a 3+. So this is really good for helping you to shut down an enemy unit that may want to fall back or run off towards another objective. So it is a fairly good ability, and I would say it's somewhat reliable. Strangle Roots are okay. Yes, it's only 3 shots, but it is wounding on 2s and doing 2 damage, so it is quite likely that you will at least cause some damage with it. The Tree Lord is 260 points, so not super cheap, but again, I think quite good for what he brings and can be well worth taking, especially if you are leaning into that monster heavy side of the faction. The slightly more important Tree Lord Ancient is a heftier 320 points. It's got the same 14 health, 3 up save, and does have a very similar profile with its attacks. Its ranged attacks are its Tendril Staff. This has got 4 shots and hits on 4s, wounds on 3s with 1 rend and D3 damage. And then again, his sweeping blows are 4s and 2s, 1 rend, 2 damage. But they also have anti-charge plus 1 rend, so he is better as this anchor unit holding off enemy charges. Where the units really differ is that the Ancient is a 1-cast wizard, which is a nice little bonus for him, and he can also interact with your wildwoods really well, awakening the wood being done in your hero phase and letting him pick a wildwood wholly within 18 inches of him and doing mortal damage on a 2+ on a D3 to each enemy unit within combat range of it. So once again, just some nice chip damage to throw out around those terrain features, which if you place them well, will be very well situated to capture a lot of enemy units around objectives or near choke points in the battlefield. His Rampage is Ground Shaker and is very strong, albeit a little bit unreliable. You pick an enemy unit in combat with him and roll a dice, and on a 4+ they get Strike Last. So as we've covered before, Strike Last being a super strong debuff, but only going off 50% of the time, it's not the most reliable. He is great, I think, overall, if you want another really strong, punchy, but also durable wizard. And he could be a great caddy for something like the Seed of Rebirth, just to keep him going for as long as possible, if you really do want to keep his damage output and spellcasting abilities in the game for as long as possible. But if you just want a pure, punchy damage output monster, then the Tree Lord does mostly the same, just a little bit cheaper. Another hero now, and another wizard, this time an infantry hero. The Branch Witch is a much cheaper 120 points and comes in with 5 health and a 5 up save. They are a 1-cast wizard and their damage output isn't great. 3 attacks on 3s and 4s with 1 rend and D3 damage, and then they also have some token shooting attacks from the Swarm of Spites, but they are very powerful for giving a unit strike first on a 3+. This lets you pick a unit wholly within 12 inches if the Branch Witch is wholly within 6 inches of a wildwood, and then you roll that d6, and on a 3+, the unit you've chosen gets strike first. So as always, not always going to go off. It's not the most reliable on a 3+, but it is pretty pokey, and I like the fact that even if it doesn't go off, you are still a 1-cast wizard, which does give you at least some backup for those 120 points. Now we're on to the main non-hero units though, and first up is the Gosam Mid Archers. These guys are 120 points for 5, so 24 points for a 2 health, 5 up save flying unit that does have some quite solid shooting. They are 2 attacks each, 3s and 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage, and the crit auto wound rule means they can do a lot of work into lighter infantry. They can also move d6 after they have shot with the rule Zephyr Spites, so they are incredibly difficult to pin down, and they can basically spend all game peppering the enemy, doing around 3 to 4 damage to a 4 up save enemy each turn, whilst your opponent will really struggle to get into combat with them. So that damage will definitely add up over the course of the game, and they can just be a super annoying, flexible unit that can help shoot off a few models from an objective, or just kill off weaker heroes and wizards, and just be an all-round nuisance over the battle. The Twist Wield were your old Warcry band. They are now 130 points and come in a unit of 8 models, each with 2 health and a 5 up save, so it's not super shabby. They do have a range of weapons with some 1 rend, 1 damage ranged attacks from the Champion Swarm Sage, and also one of the Wardens, whilst the rest have a mix of Talons and Blades, which are 3s and 4s with no rend and 1 damage on the Talons, whilst the Wardens, of which there can be 2 in the unit, they can take a Blade, which is 2 attacks each, 3s and 4s, 1 rend and 2 damage. So it's not awful, but nothing particularly mind-blowing in terms of their damage output. Where they can be useful though is their ability Eruption of Thorn Divines. This is used in any charge phase, and it lets you pick an enemy unit within 12 inches of these guys, but you can only use it if these guys are more than 6 inches away from any other Sylvaneth units. But if they are, you can do this and you can make that enemy unit minus D3 inches to their charge rolls for the turn, so turning an average of 7 into an average of 5. So this can make a big difference in your opponent's ability to actually reach combat. So they are quite a techie piece, but they are one that can make a big impact on your opponent's battle plans if you line it up right. One of the cavalry units for the Sylvaneth is the Spite Rider Lances. These are a melee focused unit with a solid 12-inch move and a whopping 5 health backed up by a 4-up save, so they are quite tanky, although at 210 points for 3, they are bordering on Skull Crusher prices, so they had better be. They do, however, have some incredibly scary melee. They've got 3 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage on the charge, and they also get +1 rend against cavalry, so they are a very anti-cav unit. But the mandibles of their mounts are 4s and 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage on the charge as well, so up to 12 damage per model when these guys charge in, which is really impressive. On top of that, they can also heal at the end of any turn. They heal 3, so they do have some great additional resilience from that perspective. And then they can get even more scary thanks to their Descent of the Spite Riders rule, which gives them strike first if they've charged on a 3+. So you can potentially be throwing out up to 18 2 damage attacks with strike first from a unit of these, which is going to do a lot of damage to almost anything they get into combat with. So these guys are just really good. They are really fast, they are really punchy, they are decently durable. I just think they are great for their cost. The other variant, the Revenant Seekers, they're a bit cheaper at 200 points for 3, but they are still the same 5 health and 4-up save, which is really good. They are less overtly damaging and more buff focused, although they are still plenty killy with the same mount attacks at 2 damage on the charge. The main difference is their main melee weapons, the Seekers' Sickles. These are 3s and 4s with 1 rend and just 1 damage, but they do gain the crit mortal rule, so they are perhaps slightly better into heavily armoured 1 health enemies. They are just 1 damage instead of 2. They do get the same healing with Thrumming with Life, but then their other rule is Harvesters of the Lamatiri, which lets you roll 3 extra dice whenever a friendly unit wholly within 12 inches of these guys uses the rally command. So they do have a lot of strength potentially sitting in the middle of your lines and letting a unit gain a few extra models back from a rally before they jet off and go after some armoured enemies with their sickles and mandibles and still do a solid amount of damage. So still very good cavalry, and I would say both of them, these and the Lancers, have a solid place in a Sylvaneth army. Another set of similar units next, which is the Karno Hunters. They come in 3 variants, either with great swords, great bows, or scythes. All the war scrolls are 5 health with a 4-up save, 5-inch move, and 2 control. And then the bows and the scythes are 200 points, whilst the great swords are a little bit pricier at 220. They do all have the Envoys of the Everqueen rule, which grants friendly Sylvaneth units a 6-up ward whilst they are contesting an objective that your hunters are also contesting. And then in terms of their differences, the great swords are 4 attacks, which are 3s and 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage and crit mortals. And then their rule is Trample Underfoot, which lets you roll a dice for each model in your unit when they have charged, and on a 3+ you do 1 mortal damage to the enemy. So when they charge in, they can do a bit of extra damage before combat actually starts. The scythes are only 3 attacks, but again, they are 3s and 3s with 1 rend. However, they are 3 damage base and also +1 rend, so 2 rend when they've been charged. So these are a good unit for being more of an anchor and dissuading enemy charges. Their rule is Tanglethorn Thicket, which is similar to the swords version, but more defensive. You again roll for each model in your unit, but when your unit is charged by the enemy, and on a 3+ you do a mortal damage back to them. So potentially 3 mortal damage from the swords when they charge, or 3 mortal damage from the scythes when they get charged. And then finally we get to the bows, which are the most different of the 3, of course, being a ranged option. They've got an 18-inch range with 2 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage. they also have the anti-hero +1 rend, so these are character killers, and they are really quite good at it, because they can ignore the guarded hero ability in your shooting phase thanks to steady aim. And what that means is that a unit of 3 will on average do nearly 4 damage to a 3-up save hero, which is pretty good going all things considered, and they can quite reliably kill off those squishier 4 or 5-up save heroes in a single volley. So they are pretty great snipers, and I think whilst they all have their place, personally I think the great bows and the great swords are my favourite. Don't get me wrong, the scythes are still very good defensively with that anti-charge rule and their flat 3 damage, but I just think the swords and the bows are the best option out of the 3. Your basic Dryads also return from the world of fantasy. They are 110 points for 10, and they are pretty squishy with only 1 health and a 5-up save. They do also only have 2 attacks which hit and wound on 4s with no rend and 1 damage, so they aren't going to kill much fast. So you may be thinking they don't seem all that good. Where they are useful, I think, is as objective holders. And the reason for that is that if they are wholly within 6 inches of one of your wildwoods, then an enemy unit is -1 to hit and -1 to wound these guys. So if you've got a wildwood near to an objective and your Dryads are within 6 inches of the wildwood but also in range of the objective, then your opponent is going to have a much harder time getting through these guys, and dropping something like a 3-up to wound, 3-up to hit Chaos Warrior, 2 4s and 4s instead does make a big difference in your durability. Just in basic terms, 20 attacks on 3s and 3s with 1 rend will kill about 7 Dryads, whereas if you drop that to 4s and 4s, it will only kill about 4. So you're almost doubling the durability of your Dryads against most attacks. So I think they are just great for sitting near your wildwoods, sitting near to objectives in range of your wildwoods, and just holding them much more effectively than your opponent might think. The Revenant units also share a lot in terms of their war scrolls. The Tree Revenants and the Spike Revenants are both 2 health with a 5-up save and a 5-inch move with 1 control. They are both 110 points for 5, but whilst the Tree Revenants are more mobility focused, with Waypiper's Dance letting you take them off the battlefield and then replace them, or put them back down should I say, 9 inches from enemies in your movement phase, the Spike Revenants are more of a debuff piece. Unbridled Malice is used in any combat phase and means on a 3+, an enemy unit can't use any command points, which is very, very strong. The Tree Revenants have got 2 attacks on 3s and 4s with 1 rend and 1 damage, whilst the Spike Revenants are 3 attacks. They don't have any rend, but they do have the crit mortal rule. So I would say with that extra attack, they are maybe slightly better in general, but if you do want that added mobility to go and claim objectives or just harass the enemy backlines, then the Tree Revenants are very useful and very, very speedy for doing that too. The last thing is the manifestations. We've got the Glade Worm, the Vengeful Skullroot, and the Spite Swarm Hive. The Glade Worm is 7 health with a 4-up save and an 8-inch move, and it has some very scary anti-wizard attacks. 6 of them that hit on 4s, wound on 2s, with 2 rend against wizards, and a D3 damage profile is fairly solid. And then on top of that, they can make enemy wizards -1 to their casting, unbinding, and banishment rolls when they are in combat with the Glade Worm. It can also be set up really close to enemy wizards with Burrow Below. This lets it in your movement phase be removed and then set back up on the board 9 inches from enemies, but only 3 inches from enemy wizards. So obviously you can't use this to counteract a unit that may be near to a wizard, but if there is a lone solo enemy wizard running around the board, you can set this thing up 3 inches from them, so you can really get close and make that wizard have a very bad time if this thing is around. The Vengeful Skullroot is a terrifying tree. It's got a 6-up ward alongside 8 health and a 4-up save, and again some decent melee, 3 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 2s with 1 rend and D3 damage, but the main thing is the Vengeful Terrors rule. That means that at the end of any turn, you can pick an enemy unit within 3 inches of this manifestation, and you subtract a value from the enemy unit's control score that is the same as the number of friendly units that have been destroyed in the battle. So by the end of the game, this could be dropping enemy control scores by 4 or 5 or 6 or even higher if a lot of your units has died, which isn't a great place to be, don't get me wrong, but it could really help you just claw some objectives back to get back in the game, and I think it can be a very strong way to, at the very least, stop an enemy holding your objectives or holding objectives as you do get towards the end game. The Spite Swarm Hive can't move, but it has 7 health and a 6-up save. It allows you to pick a friendly unit within 3 inches of it in your hero phase, and you can roll a dice, and on a 2+, you can either give that friendly unit +1 to run and charge rolls for the turn, or a 6-up ward. So you can either make a potential charge much easier, or just help a unit get near to an objective or an enemy unit a bit more easily with that extra run roll, or you can just make a unit a bit more durable near to an objective. And this could be great, I think, on a unit like Dryads, where you can give them that 6-up ward save in addition to their potentially -1 to be hit and wounded when they're near a wildwood, to make them a really good anchor for their cost in terms of their resilience. And then finally, on the topic of wildwoods, they are 8 health with a 4-up save, and they do have a few cool rules in addition to how they interact with your army traits. Overgrown Wilderness lets you shoot at enemies that may be behind or blocked by the terrain normally, so they are less defensive for your opponent than they are for you, which is nice. And then Vengeful Forest Spirit lets your Wildwood do some mortal damage in any combat phase. It lets you pick an enemy unit within the Wildwood's combat range, and on a 4+, you do D3 mortal damage to them. So again, putting these near or around objectives or in choke points on the battlefield can not only boost your units up a lot, but also do some more chip damage to the enemy as the fight rages on. So they are actually a very good bit of terrain, I think, and a vital piece of the Sylvaneth playstyle. They give you a huge amount of buffs, healing, defenses, and also this offense, which you can really play around with a lot to add quite a bit more to your war scrolls than it might initially appear. Overall, I would say the Sylvaneth are a bit odd because they play so much around the Wildwoods and they rely on them for so much of their abilities and power. So if you set them up right, they can make your army very strong. But if your opponent can get rid of them or avoid them or play around them, then a lot of your utility and strength can instead suffer. So the army as a whole, I think, is quite techy and potentially a high-skilled army, but they do have a huge amount of potential, and they can, if you play them right, be unbelievably fast and slippery, as well as having some very strong casters, monsters, and ranged units to back them up. So that is the Sylvaneth. As always, I'd love to know what you make of them and how they've been performing for you in 4th edition so far. Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.